My name is Andy Downs. I'm the director of the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics at IPFW. This will be, I think, an interesting discussion, and it's a discussion that is brought to you by the Departments of Communication and Political Science at IPFW, as well as the Civil Society and the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics. I want to thank College TV for recording it and making it available to folks. And perhaps most importantly, I would like to thank the Helmke Library for letting us take over the bottom floor, at least the north end of it, and record this conversation in there. So if you would, please give the library a round of applause for letting us invade their space. A lot of people think that libraries are supposed to be quiet places, and there are quiet places in libraries, but also libraries are places where vibrant ideas are supposed to be exchanged, and so it's very appropriate that we are here in the library. The topic today, as I said, is what is fake news, and we have a panelist who can talk about things from an academic standpoint as well as from a practical or practicing standpoint. And I'll introduce the panelists to you. First, to my immediate right is Lisa Ryan, who is a reporter and Morning Edition host at WBOI. Round of applause for her. Yes, very good. Next to her from the Department of Communication, Asim Nasser, Associate Professor in the Department of Communication. So a round of applause for him. And then finally, on the end, Professor of Political Science, Michael Wolff. Please give him a round of applause. I think that we should probably start, though, with a definition. We throw terms around all the time, but I think this is one of those instances when we really ought to start with a definition. And of course, the term I would like you to define, panelists, is fake news. How would you define that operationally for folks? And Lisa, let's go ahead and start with you.
So I think fake news, in our opinion, in the journalism world, is anything that's intentionally deceitful, anything that recklessly disregards the truth. So something that is perhaps a little bit on the biased side is not necessarily being intentionally deceitful. They might have a message that they want to share, and I'm thinking of, organizations that tend to lean more conservative or more liberal. That's not necessarily fake news, at least by the terms that I would define it. Something that is fake news is something that deliberately shares fake information or doesn't even try to check sources. So maybe a source tells them something. Who cares what their credentials are? Who cares anything about that? They're going to publish it. So I think that for when I'm speaking of fake news, that would be what I'm referring to.
Awesome.
I would add to Lisa's opinion and her definition of fake news being, yes, not researched, something that is perhaps deceitful, meant to misinform people, but also add to that, taking it in the direction that is politically favorable or intended to dissuade people from one point to another. But I also want to kind of add another layer to that in terms of reporting and in terms of how journalist practices come about, especially in the age of no context whatsoever. With the age of social media, when we have statements that are limited to 140 characters or, to just major headlines and so on, we kind of take away from context. So I just want to pose the question, maybe we can consider talking about it later on. How can we, incorporate, ideas of facts and truth into this idea of fake news? So kind of expanding the question on what is fake news.
Mm-hmm. Mike?
I just thought they were alternative facts, so.
Shortest answer so far.
I agree wholeheartedly, but I think we're going to have a fast-changing definition as well, because we've seen a market open on this, with people just creating things in Macedonia or Russia and sending them out there for the consumer to kind of go that way. So we might see this definition dynamically change as we go, but this is a solid definition.
How much of this do we have to consider to be intent? In order for it to be fake news, how much intent does there have to be? In other words, if someone simply gives misinformation without checking into it, are they engaging in fake news, or does there have to be a malicious intent, so to speak?
I think that goes into kind of one of the points that I made, which would be a reckless disregard for the facts. So sometimes a journalist is pressed for time. I can speak from firsthand experience on sometimes there's a deadline and mistakes happen, but a valid credentialed media source will correct those mistakes. They'll make those mistakes known. Hopefully they rarely happen, but I think that in terms of what you're saying, I think that it would have to be they just don't care. They aren't checking sources deliberately.
In terms of journalism, you mentioned sometimes, deadlines happen, you have to get something out, but we also have 120 years worth of journalism schools out there developing the standards by which you have to operate. What are a couple of the rules that you have to live by as a journalist?
I think that one of the most important rules that I personally live by is doing my best to present all sides. And notice that I say all sides and not both sides. A lot of people think of it as two-sided. Everything is two-sided. And that is certainly not the case. So I think that was like rule number one in journalism school, was that there are so many different sides to any sort of argument, any sort of presentation. And I think that one of the things that when people are reading the news and they think that something is fake, they think it's fake because their side isn't equally represented. So when they're reading it and they're thinking, well, I have these opinions and that only got a paragraph, whereas the other side got, so much in a story. I get emails and calls like that quite often, actually. And usually that's because as a journalist, we aren't trying to balance things out to make it fair. We're trying to balance it out in terms of if 90% of the people who show up to a town hall feel one way and 10% feel one way, you're probably going to see the story positioned in that way as well. And if you're seeing your side not represented at all, sometimes that's not because we're trying to mislead people or lead people away from your side. Maybe you didn't show up to that town hall at all. So maybe you're just a 1% and you didn't show up, so maybe we just aren't aware of that perspective. But we are aware all of the time that there are so many different perspectives that can be represented, so many different angles to a story, and we just do our best to balance that all out.
But when it comes to an actual fact, a detail, what's the standard for that? In other words, if you're going to publish that, so-and-so did the following, or this policy will do the following, what do you need to say that's now something I'm comfortable publishing?
So oftentimes it will be just that a source said something. So if we can't independently verify it, but it could still be true, or it's a subjective sort of thing, an opinion, we'll just post this person, politician, congressman, whoever said this, and we'll attribute it to that source. If it is a fact and we can verify it, tax rates are going up and this is what is happening. It is a fact and we can verify it by hopefully reading that document. That's the journalism rule that I live by, always read the documents. Then we verified it as a journalist, and that's when you'll see it presented as a fact in the story.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, Jim.
Actually, just a follow-up question. So would you consider opinion more than fact to be fake news, or where does that stand?
Can you explain that?
So when you have more editorial on certain television or cable news channels or whatnot, kind of giving you their opinion and speculation and so on, I guess the giveaway is speculation here, right? But there seems to be more hypotheticals about a specific case or a scenario rather than backing this up by fact. Does that fit under fake news?
No, I don't think it does, but that's why you are all here. Is because you need to be educated consumers of news, and when you're watching CNN or any sort of live anything where people are saying their opinions, you need to know where these sources are coming from, and that's what makes it especially hard, especially in TV, because you don't get the same as when you're reading it in print. You could clearly say, Republican congressman says this, and well, that's where that bias is. That's where it's leaning. But if you're just seeing someone on TV, you think, oh, wow, that seems like a very legitimate source. And maybe you turn off the TV or turn off the radio before you even hear the other side. And while that's not fake news, I don't think, it definitely needs to be said that you need to come in and make sure that you know that those are opinions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it used to be kind of a clear line, right? If you read the newspaper, there was the news portion, and then there was the editorial page, and that's where opinion showed up. It was very clearly labeled as such, and the lines have blurred a little bit as we've had the advent of 24-hour news channels looking to fill 24 hours worth of content, or having 24 hours worth of content. It's made a little bit of a difference.
It's definitely the weakness of that medium, I think, is just that people are talking, and especially during live coverage, you definitely need to be a smart news consumer then, because you have to be aware that their facts might not be verified. And so many times when I'm writing something or it's a recorded piece for radio, I'm double checking, triple checking, making sure that word has these connotations. You know, you don't want to sound like you're leaning a certain way. And when you're just speaking like we are right now, so many times you might say the wrong word. You meant to say this other word, a synonym. And because you said that word, it's now going a different direction. And so that's why it's especially true during live TV and live radio.
Mm-hmm. People make mistakes, is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, no, I did not realize that.
No, except for me.
Of course. The term fake news is getting used quite a bit. You all gave a definition for it. Who do you think should really be using the term? I mean, who can label something as fake news? Do you need credentials to do this? Mike, do I need a set of credentials to label something as fake news?
Not really, but we do see, I mean, we've seen an industry grow probably since after the 1988 election of fact-checking, that the media really kind of looked at their role increasingly as one to try and check politicians as they were making appeals during campaigns. And the irony, of course, is that it has really done a pretty good job, and we've seen some outlets really put their future into detailing how factual things are. The irony is, in different ways, is that this doesn't necessarily necessarily change people's views of what was originally reported in fake news. Because what we've seen, and this happens in negative advertising too, attack advertising, is that simply having the fact checkers reiterate over and over and over the kind of main claim that is often fake, what they're doing is really repeating something and making people more familiarized with it. And we have a familiarity bias that comes. So in effect, one of our key, at least in the political science realm, fact checkers of academics, or who can just be ignored. Academics are often just ignored. But more the mainstream, I guess, fact-checking organizations have this irony attached that even though it's very good journalism quite often, you end up maybe not on the consumer side having that corrected.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Does it matter who's applying the label?
That's a very interesting question. I was kind of, thinking about, why does it really matter? Because anybody can utter the word, fake news. So from an expert, maybe that kind of connotates the expertise has something to say about this. But when you hear the President of the United States taking a stand that suggests, oh, anything that goes against this presidency or the administration or the way, he was elected, or the crowds that congregated on Inauguration Day, you kind of wonder, is that just a label for the sake of, putting a term to push out there? It really reminds me, the term fake news really reminds me of the use of the word terrorism. How it's the shortcut for so many things without really much context for things that go beyond that, right? Because we're so easy to just, claim things to be evil, and by all means, all act of terror or violence are very bad, evil, right? But does it just come out of nothing? Or where does it really kind of come from? So with the same token, kind of looking at fake news, and how is it that we've generated, this aura about the term, depending on who is it coming from? So it kind of poses a question, and I wish I had a more clear answer for that, or a clearer.
Well, it is a newer term, and so we're still getting a feeling for what it actually means. And if we do this 6 months from now, there may be a different spin that we put on it, so to speak, than we put on it today. And that's part of the issue here. We haven't clearly defined the term, therefore people have the opportunity to define it for us if we're not careful.
Right. The term maybe is new, or it's kind of, the latest language that we have for it, but the concept is not. I mean, Roger Ailes and his station, basically, Fox News, they thrived over, kind of creating news and kind of, again, speculation and going over that. And so how can you not label this within or under the umbrella of fake, right? Despite there being a shred of truth behind that, there's something about the expansion of a shred of truth into something that goes way beyond the facts.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, as a journalist, does it matter to you who gives uses the term?
I think that there's a certain definition of fake news, and just because you don't like it or just because you don't agree with it doesn't make it fake. So from a journalistic standpoint, I think that we need to stick with the definition of it and not just discredit a whole organization or a journalist just by publishing something that you don't necessarily agree with.
Mm-hmm. Now, for those of you who have not looked up the CVs of all of our panelists up here, part of what Awesome does is actually look at social norms in terms of social media. How has the use of a term like fake news changed our shared understanding of what news is, at least within the social media realm?
I think there's a polarization. I'm going to go back to political slogans and how we understand the United States of America and United We Stand. Are we really united? Because I think there's a major polarization. The conversation is not on the same level anymore. When you compare the social media and the feedback and the comments and the blogs that are taking place on both sides of the political spectrum. And yes, sadly, I said both sides to echo Lisa's point that, there shouldn't be just two sides to a political spectrum. There should be just, a variety of political points. In any case, looking at, this spectrum and how people are very much divided, and it's basically people assuming or taking one position, and that seems to be universal to that major party. So if you are, let's say, against taxation, or if you are pro, women's rights or what have you, you're more likely to follow, or at least social media, statistically speaking, you're more likely to follow the political side that has many other things. So you're lumped in with all the other formats or all the other political nodes that follow that liberal versus conservative side, if that is clear.
And because we have a tendency to go to those social media outlets or have connections via social media of folks who have the same opinion as us, we sort of develop a shared understanding of terms, of positions on issues, of how the world is running at this point, and we're missing a dialogue here.
There certainly is a missing dialogue. If a dialogue were to occur, hypothetically speaking, there seems to be a disconnect. And this disconnect is basically people are looking at different things, whether facts or not. They're looking at different things and they're comparing, the dialogue is completely missing the thread.
Mike, part of this is obviously about the technology that's available right now, but there are other factors going on that make this dynamic possible today. What sort of things are making it possible today?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't a one-way street. The other side of this is that the American voter is out there consuming this. And part of that is, as Asim said, we're the context of the time. This populism is where we're at, and facts don't always do well in eras of populism. And part of that is due to the big issues we face. If I had read an Introduction to American Politics textbook, as I probably did 30 years ago, it would have looked very different. We would never have imagined seeing impeachment, wars, terrorism, issues of gender and race as we do today. So the American public has been asked to go through a lot, and it's no wonder that some of their response has been emotional. And political leaders have not the political elites have, instead of kind of guarding our institutions against it, have jumped in and used populism to their own advantage. So I mean, ask Richard Lugar or John Boehner what it's like to kind of stand up to populism. So in turn then, we're in an atmosphere of negative partisanship as well, where you see kind of a distrust of the media anyway that we've always had. And maybe that has opened an era of high passions, acceptance of other sources as okay. And the political psychology literature opens the door to this because we are in an era where we're more driven by negative partisanship than our own feelings toward our political party. And that allows the negative bias that maybe we'll pay attention to that news source coming in saying something bad about someone I hate and let it trickle along. And this is kind of natural then to where the American voter has always been. It's just the changed nature of the contextual times that kind of what Lisa and Asim are talking to have allowed this maybe, ironically, in an era of fire hose of information in fact, allow our biases to even kind of add to our ability to kind of pick and choose sometimes very unhealthy sorts of news.
Mike, are the advantages to labeling something fake news short-term or long-term? Can you envision a situation where, it's easy, I think, to envision a situation where there's a short-term gain to calling something fake news. Can you envision situations where there's a long-term gain to labeling something as fake news?
We'll see. I mean, we're in a time right now where we're seeing a big pushback by the so-called mainstream media. And I think in the last 2 weeks, you've probably seen newspaper articles that 10 years ago, each one of them would have won a Pulitzer, come out day after day after day. And I'm not defending necessarily some of the, but I think if you read some of these things, it's unbelievable what we've seen. So I think you tempt yourself by, in the short term, there's huge benefit, and we know that. And we've seen that not just in the United States, but elsewhere. But in the long term, I think there's a price to pay because hopefully truth wins out in the end, and kind of the ability to deliberate about these issues and to have facts eventually kind of percolate up. But I'm hazarding in this realm. We're still new to this in a lot of ways.
Lisa, do you see only short-term advantages to the label or long-term advantages? What do you see?
Well, I want to talk about this from both sides. So on the one side, from a journalist perspective, long term, we've actually seen subscriptions of newspapers go up on a national and local level. Here in public broadcasting, we've seen listenership go up. We recently had listenership gains across the country. So there really is a desire out there for real news. And then when people find that and they trust the source, they put money where their ears and their mouths are, and they want that news. So I think that that's really important and a great thing that we're seeing on the positive spectrum. But then, of course, on the negative side, if you have someone constantly calling something fake news, then you have these people on the extremes just getting more and more extreme. You have people going to their side and not trusting, again, the so-called mainstream media. I hate using that term. I hate lumping any journalistic organizations into just the media, because I think that implies some sort of agenda, as a lot of people think that there is. And no, we're just journalists getting paid to hopefully watch out for government officials and just trying to give you the best information that we possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
I very much agree with you. I just want to take it back a little bit to the so-called, the not just the label, but what's behind the mainstream media, right? The traditional news channels or cable news or whatever newspapers, and kind of look at, actually both of you use the term consumers. And that's the sad part, is that news agencies and television and newspapers consider readers and viewers and audiences as consumers. And that is a problem. That is a fundamental problem in the sense that news is not really free. It has agenda. There's, a framing and the agenda setting and the gatekeeping of what stories can make it in and not. So, right, when we talk about fake news and when we talk about how, things are not factual, well, I mean, we can kind of take it even farther and look at what news is making it to CNN. How come that every time you tune in the morning, there's more of a story about a cow giving birth rather than, some atrocity committed somewhere in the world, right? And all of a sudden, why do people have sentiments towards, the United States in one way or the other, right? So I think that's a fundamental problem. And lucky you're from a public broadcasting organization, right? So I think we should kind of pay credit where credit is due in terms of how is it that profit and news kind of work together. I don't think they really do. Mm-hmm. And I just need to push that in there as well in terms of discussing fake news and the news that we pay attention to.
Mike?
I just wanted to ask you then, if you thought, we know NPR and NIPR are tremendous news sources, and the idea of public, are other societies that have like a BBC or publicly invested, public good-oriented media, Do you think they avoid some of this because there's a kind of culture, a public good culture behind it?
Well, there is. I can never say that all institutions that are not for profit function in a complete void of pressures or whatnot. Because even NPR and PBS, you do have, those call-ins to kind of contribute and what have you. So yes, we are accountable to listeners in a way, not as much as CNN and Fox to their advertisers. I mean, they fired Bill O'Reilly because of the advertisers, not because of what actually happened or the allegations for such things, right? So it is a little bit on the different side. So if you think about the BBC, yes, it's publicly funded. It's based on tax money, but eventually it kind of answers to the will of the citizens, of the audience. I research Al Jazeera and the satellite channel that originates in Qatar, and it is funded by the government. It's not, the monies that they get are not particularly from any for-profit advertisement. So the question is, what is it that they're doing, and how is it that it promotes the news? And yes, it's very much one-sided that benefits Qatar, although Al Jazeera basically claims to be the free voice in the Arab world. So there are always some biases. I think there are always some restrictions on from the editorial board or from the structure of an organization that kind of limit the news that comes out.
And part of what we're looking for in media, though, is independence, isn't it? And the question is, how do we get the independence? You still have to, people have to get paid. Lisa needs to get paid, I think. She's not independently wealthy, so she needs to get paid. We've got to find a way to deal with that. And whether that's through public funding or through private advertising, someone's going to have a vested interest there.
Yeah.
But see, I have to disagree with you in some ways, because I personally think that there is a very big line between the editorial side and the journalistic side. And I speak from someone who's working as a journalist, because IPFW, which we're wonderfully being hosted by right now, underwrites with WBOI. So every morning I read WBOI is sponsored by IPFW. And that did not stop me in any way, shape, or form from reporting on the recent split between IU and Purdue here in Fort Wayne. So I think from a journalist standpoint, we're completely separated from any sort of revenue sources. We don't have any pressure put on us from that. And I think that when you're looking at sources of news, you have to be sure of, you have to pay attention to where the revenue is coming from and what might be influencing it. But any solid, valid news source will not be paying attention to where their revenue is coming from. That's on the other side of the building, quite literally, at WBOI.
Now, Lisa, since you're a journalist, you're out there, you're talking with folks, you actually have been able to see how this term might be influencing the interaction between the public and public officials. Have you noticed any sort of change in I would say, your long years here in Fort Wayne, but haven't been that long yet? Do you notice a difference? Do you hear journalists saying there is definitely a difference between that relationship right now?
Probably not locally, but I think that, and Asim might agree because I'm going to bring social media into this, I think that one of the things that we're seeing right now is that public officials have a direct line to the public. So if you, as someone who's consuming the news, I'm sorry I'm using that term, is going out there.
I think it's very accurate. That's the thing. Yeah.
And they're going out and you're looking at news sites and to get your news. That's awesome because you're reading what a journalist has. They've validated their sources and made sure that they're bringing you all sorts of different perspectives and summarizing them, and they're checking everything in that story. But if you just go on Twitter and you're just reading straight from public officials, well, you know it, I know it, everybody knows it. That's not like a valid source in the journalism world, but it might be for a politician. That might be their sources. And so I think that it's important to notice where you're getting your sources of information. So are you getting them from a journalist who's then getting it from a variety of sources, or are you going straight to the public official? And they're taking advantage of that. They're going straight to you. They're putting their opinions out there. on social media or any other way. And a lot of people are just sidestepping journalists altogether and just going straight to that.
Mike's actually been live tweeting this whole time. I'm not sure what he's been saying, but he's been live tweeting it. Awesome. What do we see in the social media realm, the nature of the relationship between public officials and the public?
Wow. I should have some
I was
data
going to say
on
we
that,
only have
right?
like half an hour, so keep that in mind when you're giving your answer.
I'm sorry, but I don't have the data on that. I can only imagine from, just the anecdotal information that pops up on my social media feed, and of course it's going to be more on the liberal side. But yeah, there seems to be, followers or accusations of the blind following of, politicians. Some people do it for the love of comedy. Let that sink in for a second. Others just do it for the sake of, let's see what's really happening. So it's a really murky side. I feel it's not the politicians who are tweeting, but there are simply these news agencies that are, online, that are more social media based, Vox, Politico, so on and so forth, or from the other side, Breitbart or what have you. That are pretty much making the noise and basically being retweeted or messaged through Facebook or whatever other social media format you have.
In some respects, Mike, it has actually become quite a bit easier for an elected official, a public official, to get noticed because of social media. In spite of all the noise that's out there, if you are particularly witty, if you're good with 140 characters, suddenly you are someone who's people are paying attention to.
Yeah, and this is one of the things I noted about relative to the social norms that used to kind of govern Washington is that when you first were in Congress, you're supposed to shut up for 10 years and then work your way up the system. And now what we see is new people on the scene who quickly work up, often because they have access through, just being entrepreneurs with the media or some other way. And so it's changed the rules and the incentives. So now for young members, it's better to be a firebrand rather than kind of learn the ways of the institutions and respecting the institutions. And so we've seen the social norms more generally melt across Washington and lead to kind of maybe more of a pervasive ability to be uncivil and lead to this kind of feeding the negative side of people's partisanship that leaves them again open maybe to some of the fake news on their antenna.
This is a little unfair since none of you are straight outright journalism teachers or doing history of journalism, but can you think of a historical example that had a similar impact in terms of the way news is consumed, or a label like this that's actually run, it becomes something onto itself? It's a little unfair to put you on the spot like this.
I can think of a phenomenon which you probably can back up, but I mean, going back to McCarthyism and the Red Scare, wasn't that all about kind of, hyping somebody up and saying, oh goodness, communism right there, this person is a communist, and it is a witch hunt. The word has really taken a different, the term has taken a different meaning recently, but anyway. I mean, the same thing that happened with, Obama, right? So anybody who listens to a very particular side of the political dialogue, if you can call it that, basically has a belief that this country is turning to be a socialist country and whatnot. Do you have any additions, Lisa, or any thoughts?
Well, I would think there was a good addition, and again, one where good journalism helped dig up to and uproot what was an unhealthy kind of aspect going on in society. When in fact, journalists were being attacked for the same thing. If they were critical, right? They could have been thrown under the bus as communists as well.
So I don't have any big sort of movement or any defining phrase or anything like that, but I just want to say that historically, it's interesting to go back and read newspaper articles and, radio and TV then too. I'm talking like way back, but like before radio and TV existed. And you read these articles, and they are so incredibly biased. They are filled with all sorts of colorful phrases, and I'm not talking just like descriptions that make it fun to read. I'm talking things that are saying like, and then the fantastic mayor came forward and did these wonderful things. And I think that it's great for journalism historically that we're seeing, at least the main papers, the main radio stations and TV stations that you're going towards I think that they've gone away from that. So of course you can go to the extreme ends of any of the political spectrum and find things like that still, but I think that for the most part, everything's gotten a little bit more moderate.
When Lisa was talking about way back in time, I was worried for a little while how far back we were going to go.
No, I was talking
Thanks
about
for going that
radio.
far back. Thank you. Thank you for going that far back. Awesome. You had something you wanted to add?
I just wanted to add something about, in comparison, how do you feel this works with, the fairness doctrine, where, you had a doctrine that actually imposed on journalists that, you take multiple sources under the kind of cloak of being fair. But then again, can a story be fair? And I know your answer is probably going to be yes. But there are some biases, and maybe, and this is my own opinion, that I'd much rather know where people stand in a particular news organization to kind of know, okay, these are the biases, so I can weed that out and kind of interact with the news story, as opposed to just take everything for granted. Oh yeah, this is the fairness doctrine really suggested that there should be fairness to all sides, or giving equal time to all people.
Mm-hmm. I am very aware of that argument, and I know a lot of people say that just let your biases be known. Just instead of people calling the Washington Post a little bit liberal, maybe just let them say it like it is. Just have them say that they're that they're just going to be the Democratic paper, and then the Wall Street Journal can be the conservative paper, and we can just all know what the biases are. I 100% disagree. I think, and this is my own journalistic bias coming forward, in that I think that journalists can be unbiased. So it's kind of contradictory on my part, but I really believe that I might have my own personal opinions about something, but I think that as a journalist, I put all of that away and write the story in a fair way, at least as fair as I could possibly be. And I think that a lot of people see that, and I think that one of the ways to test that, we have like an ongoing joke in the newsroom that if both sides are calling to complain, oh, I'm sorry, I used both sides. If everyone's calling to complain, then you know that you've done something right, and we get that a lot. And I think that that is truly a pretty great way of seeing that you are reporting on something fairly.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, do journalists need to worry about this phrase fake news and what it's doing to the understanding of things?
100%. That's why I'm here, because I think that calling something fake news when it's not incredibly discredits the entire journalistic industry. I think that it, calling these papers that have tried to present arguments fairly fake news, I think that then people are not going to them for their news, and as we mentioned earlier, maybe going straight to the government official. And when that happens, I mean, that's borderline propaganda, that you're not even getting, the democratic industry of journalism and fact-checking and all of that, and you're just only hearing government propaganda. And so I think that it really discredits journalists.
Mike, she's suggesting elected officials might present biased information?
Never.
Never.
No, this is one of the problems that we're facing, as I noted, with changing norms, is that in previous times your avenues upward in power very much hinged on your patience and your ability to prove your intellect and your experience. And as this has changed, then we've seen a change in the environment and of what information is. And we oftentimes beat up the American voter for not knowing enough. But if you look at the information system that they're in, with public officials giving purposefully shaded, at best, information, and then even good journalists can carry this along and try and present what is, a volleyball game of doom of information. Why are we blaming the American voter for sometimes not being as informed when they're being misinformed too? And that's, even through a healthy media environment. So I think that this is especially kind of noteworthy in this context.
Obviously, fake news, there are issues around fake news, but there's always something you can pull out of information that's being disseminated, whether it's accurate or not accurate news. What kind of things can people be pulling out of something that is labeled fake news, or that we find out is actually, quote, fake news, intentionally distributed for a malicious reason? What can we learn from that?
Well, I want to
Lisa?
start by talking about what you can pull from perhaps any information that you're taking in. And that is, maybe you get an idea. Maybe you start to form an opinion, or you already have an opinion, and then you're learning more about it. I would say then just to double check and triple check something. So if you see something presented as a fact, make sure that it really is. Make sure other news articles and stories are also reporting on that. So I think that that's one way that you can pull forward any sort of information. And then when it comes to actually fake news, I think that the thing that you need to pull from that, I guess the thing that you could take away from that is not to trust things. So I guess from a journalistic standpoint, we have a saying that if your mother says she loves you, check it out. So I think that applies to you as people taking in information as well. If you're reading something, and even if it's one of your most trusted news organizations, even if it's, my love, NPR, even if it's NPR, if you're unsure of something or if it's breaking news, go check it out on a different site. Make sure that you really know that to be true before changing your opinion, before sharing that information. Make sure that it really is true.
Mike, what do we pull from the propaganda, as someone called it earlier, from the fake news? What can we learn from it?
Well, instead of pulling, I would say pushing a little bit. So a lot of us have probably seen fake news in our social media environment. And the night before the election, I can't tell you how many doomsday things I saw that were insane coming across. But I think it's important for us. One of the Shorenstein Center at Harvard did a big study on this with a lot of political scientists and communication people. And one of the things they noted, and it fits with political psychology literature, is that when you're in an environment of social media, these are people you somewhat trust, at least. And if some information passes along in there and it's with somewhat trustworthy person, you're likely to give it a little more credence than maybe it deserves. So the idea is when you find out it's wrong, you have to gently go back to the person and say, this information is, because they have a stream of people that are reading it as well. So rather than just pulling, I think people have to push, and it's hard to do. I'm friends on Facebook with some insane people on all political spectrum, and because of my position, I don't like to kind of weigh in very often, but it's something the rest of you should do. But but it is important, because when people don't hear that, and there's the spiral of silence, as it's called, when people don't hear it, they have the sense that their opinion is actually a huge majority opinion, when in fact it might be very kind of compartmentalized or smaller, and they have we have this kind of view that, well, no, my attitude is correct and this piece of fake news is correct. So I think it's incumbent upon us as citizens to kind of do that.
What's interesting is all the people who are linked with Mike in some way on social media right now are thinking the other people are the insane people he was talking about a moment ago.
I'm not.
That's right. Awesome. What can we glean from fake news?
Wow. How intricate people are with their creative means and how they do things. I think we should definitely look into the sources or the motives for people creating such kind of news. So yes, skepticism, absolutely. Be skeptical of everything. And by doing so, I think we should be looking at the sources, the funding, what is behind them. So the political agenda that seems to be motivating a particular blogger or a particular news source or whatnot. What can we get from this? I think this is certainly a fast-paced evolutionary period of news and information gathering and distribution. I think this definitely kind of can pose a question in terms of where are we heading with this. This is a moment of awakening, I think, for American society, for the entire world perhaps. Things are going to change. I don't know in what direction, but people are kind of awoken to the fact that this is not right. There's something absurd about the case and how we have it. So when Lisa said something about how there are so many people now kind of contributing to or becoming members of WBOI or public media or purchasing newspapers, there's we're kind of moving away from this new phenomenon of just anybody can write anything and here we send it off. So people are becoming skeptical. And if anything we can take from this phenomenon of fake news is this awakening and this kind of retracting and kind of let's take a step back. How can we readdress our lives? How can we readdress the ways that we've been presented with the world around us?
Where are you? We've talked about the readership going up and listenership going up. Where are people getting news right now?
Well, I think that there are different types of people in this world, and I think that increasingly, and this is why we're seeing fake news pop up more and more, increasingly people are going to these partisan websites. They're going to things that might even distribute fake news intentionally, as we've mentioned, that they really are planning on deceiving you and trying to lead you to a certain way. And unfortunately, a lot of people are going that direction, or perhaps not going anywhere at all. Maybe social media is their only tool for getting news. And in that case, it's even more important to step up and say, hey, this is fake, because that might be at least one person's only source of news. And I'd like to share an example in that somebody on my Facebook page shared something that the headline was, President Trump is impeached. Now, I, of course, as you know, that's not true. So I immediately said, I didn't even click on it because I won't, do that. I just said, that's fake, right? And he said, yeah, of course, it was a joke. So then I click on it and I'm like, why is this funny? And in the text it said, of course he didn't, you special snowflake. So it's supposed to be deceitful. It's supposed to be, making fun of people. And I said, I don't find this funny. And I said, and there were other people commenting like, did he really? Wow, I had no idea. And it was like, that's exactly why, because people aren't clicking on it. They just only read the headlines. And that's why, satire, I find that funny. The Onion, that's funny, these funny articles, but that was not, in my opinion, funny, because it was meant to be intentionally deceitful. And I think that you all can share the truth. You can make sure that people stop spreading things like that. So I think that more and more we're seeing people go to polarized sources or not share news at all.
Where else are people getting their news right now? Asim or Mike? Where?
Go ahead.
As noted, there is kind of a return to more of the mainstream media and some of the big outlets right now. I don't know if that's momentary and situational or what, but it's. The irony is when we're talking about going to biased sources or fake news sources and where we're collecting it, is it's an era when being a journalist isn't all that much fun, because you can have whole newsroom sacked at papers, or be in Syria and have ISIS grab you and decapitate you. The actual job of journalism right now is harder in a lot of ways than it's ever been, and yet the kind of output on the I guess consumer side is so rife with junk. So it's really unfortunate in a lot of ways.
Obviously, one of the things people are going to be interested in knowing is where you think good information comes from. What are good sources, whether they're news sources or just primary source information?
Can I go back just a little bit, just
Sure.
to complete the answer? Lisa mentioned satire. Satire actually shows like The Daily Show, the TBS one with, I can't remember her name. Samantha Bee, thank you. Right, and HBO with Bill Maher and John Oliver and all that. These have become incredibly popular, and I just read an article about that a few weeks ago about how people are seeking, an answer to the absurdity of political life, and they have been seeking that answer for the past few years, not necessarily with this election, but they kind of look for humor in the political, because at least, I don't know, maybe it's the millennials, maybe it's the generation itself is kind of feeling disenfranchised, but they look for these sources to kind of give them answer and to kind of give them an analysis where news media, cable news has really failed because all you have is talking heads barking at each other. CNN has like 9 panels of 9 people, 9, you know, like frames, people talking over one another. And you kind of wonder, what am I getting from this? So that's just one idea. But going back to your question, what was your question? I'm sorry.
Where do people get news? Where do you get your news?
Good sources.
Wow.
Good
That's
sources.
a very hard one. Not really. I mean, I know my sources. I am one of those who've gone back to the well-established organizations, Washington Post, New York Times. I actually look at the Wall Street Journal. I kind of get the gamut of it, more of the online versions of those. But mostly, if I were to kind of consider what do I do to kind of make sure and distill like real news, is basically to look up multiple sources on one specific issue, to look up basically the sources that they use, that I kind of look at the references, and every now and then I kind of check the references. It's like, okay, is this a real reference or not? But the question that comes beyond that, who has the time to do that, right? I mean, this is where we kind of trust journalists to kind of do the work for us, and thankfully you're one of them, Lisa. So, right, but I think life is so bogged down with people having multiple jobs or multiple chores in their lives and so on, that citizenship has kind of declined, and that's my personal opinion, because of the life demands that we have, that people don't care as much about political life unless now that something hit the fan.
Yeah, obviously for a number of years, we just trusted journalists. They were the ones who were trained to do this. We had gotten well beyond the good old days of 2 newspapers writing an article about the same thing, where there was a massive crowd or no crowd whatsoever, depending on who was writing it. And we trusted them. They became our filter. But now with the fire hose, I believe Mike called it, of information, we're in a position where we have to begin evaluating information and facts in ways that we hadn't necessarily before. Lisa?
And I think that that's so unfortunate because, as Mike said, there's Pulitzer Prize-winning articles being made every single day. I mean, journalists are really searching out the facts, and in this post-fact world, I've heard that phrase tossed around a lot, that people aren't, you know, looking for the facts. Journalism has become even more important. So even if some people are trusting journalists less, I think that if anything, the journalism is getting better and better. And to answer your question about the sources, on a national level, I have subscriptions to the Washington Post and the New York Times, but I also want to encourage people. Oh, and of course NPR. I am personally a member of my local public radio station. But I think that local journalism is so incredibly important, and we forget about that. And I just want to instill after this discussion that you know, the Washington Post is not coming to Fort Wayne, Indiana to talk about whether or not your taxes are being raised or the infrastructure in Indiana. So I think it's just so important to support local journalism and turn to these sources because you truly can trust them.
Mike?
Yeah, I'd say I want to reiterate that, and I say this to students all the time and to everyone. You don't know how solid of a media environment we live in Fort Wayne. If you went to cities that are bigger, you would see newspapers. Pittsburgh, Detroit, these cities don't have a daily newspaper anymore showing up at their door. We're a good market size. We have healthy newspapers, which is really noteworthy. We have pretty good, I think, local television news. We got a great NPR station, obviously. And they do a good job of partnering with universities and other things to really bolster. And so I think we are lucky here. And I do, to reiterate also with the sources, obviously National Public Radio, long-form journalism, it doesn't always work, and it gets killed and snuffed out a lot. Al Jazeera America, for one. I mean, so we see that these are treasures that we need to kind of invest in. And the Washington Post, for instance, and New York Times to some extent, have also opened their doors to outside academics. The Political Science has a blog and a regular article now in the Washington Post. It never would have 25 years ago. the monkey cage, and it informs about contemporary research in a way that really helps contextualize what's occurring now, that it's not all brand new, that in fact there's some human behavioral science behind some of these situations. So I think that it is a good day for the media. It doesn't mean that it was hallelujah or that we're on a unilinear growth up. This probably comes out of a dark time in the early 2000s, I think, where you hear some people at the Washington Post themselves say we missed some signs we should have been more critical on before, no matter what your opinion is about the invasion of Iraq. I think that a lot of journalists have questioned themselves and whether they dug deeply enough against the elites on this. So it doesn't mean it's always going to stay, in other words, or that we're always going to get it right, but the institutions, I think, are pretty solid right now.
I do want to remind people, Awesome did suggest you go look for a primary source when a newspaper article, a radio station, et cetera, when they cite something. There's nothing wrong with going to look for it. That's part of that fire hose of information that's available to us. And I want to throw one in, and that's to perhaps go looking for an international source as well, whether that is one that requires foreign language to be spoken or whether you find one there's the BBC or CBC or something else, just as another avenue. If you would all please give the panelists a round of applause. We have now reached the point in this discussion where you take over. And as you'll recall, Alexis Macklin, Dean of the Library here at Helmke Library, has a microphone for you, not so that everybody in the world will hear you, but so that we will record your voice accurately. So if we could, let's get a couple of questions from the audience.
Yes, you said these fake news that are in the big newspapers and stuff. Do you know why? Do you know why they have fake news in the newspapers?
Why does fake news end up showing up?
You were saying about these big papers that you read. Yeah, why do we have fake? I mean, people make up these news just to get people going. Do you know why they make people going?
So I think that the biggest thing is going back to revenue. So a lot of these fake news websites are making money off of them. And then on a less extreme note, maybe it's not fake, but it's clickbait. And you're seeing things that are, you'll never guess what this celebrity did and that sort of thing. And it's getting you to click on it because of the profits. So I think that that's one of the primary reasons. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to make a couple of observations rather than a question. First of all, from the point of view of a news consumer, healthy skepticism is very important. Secondly, from the point of view of people who are in the journalist profession, it's extremely important that we understand your training, your background, the ethics, and the way you perform your jobs. And in that vein, I'd like to put in a plug. My name is Bob Brandt, and I'm with Free Thought Fort Wayne. Coincidentally, we're putting on a presentation in the main library downtown on Thursday evening from 6:30 to 8 o'clock, and it's entitled Real Journalism in the Age of Fake News, Lying Media, and Alternative Facts. Our speaker is Sherry Skufka, the editor of the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette. So it's open to the public and free, and I invite all of you who are interested in this subject to turn out and share that information with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Next question. Go ahead,
If
Lisa.
I could add to that, actually, I think that it is important to know journalists and their intentions and their training, and also to realize that a lot of the sources that you trust have bad journalists, and a lot of maybe the biased sources that you think, oh yeah, Fox News is always conservative, have journalists that are truly trying to be unbiased and do their best. So I think that it's important to realize that we're all just humans doing our job for the most part.
You spoke earlier about how the Washington Post admitted that they weren't as investigative on some of the issues that they should have been before. Do you feel that it was actually kind of President Trump's calling them these organizations fake news that has inspired the journalists of late to be more aggressive in actually, reporting everything, the facts, and getting to the bottom of it? 'Cause it seems like for years they kind of softballed on a lot of what politicians did, and you really didn't get that deep investigative journalism that we're seeing right now. Do you think that his comments are really what inspired that, or is it a blowback from the truly fake websites and that was being sent out?
Mike?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of it, I think recent things, Donald Trump was tremendous for the U.S. media overall. I mean, for CNN, for everybody. I mean, the guy got everyone lit up and got viewership and all this other stuff. Now, it's one thing campaigning and another thing transitioning to governance. And so I think the skepticism, and remember, these are political elite and media elite that said this guy has no chance, this guy's this and that and all this other stuff, and quite often they were wrong. Not the political science projection models, by the way, but a lot of the other analysis were wrong. And right now the media should always be kind of contesting those in power. That's their role. And so I think that probably it's a mixture of things. I think part of it is a Trump effect and a sense of checking. And secondarily, it's also probably a learning curve of we need to be more skeptical and ask more questions instead of other things. But I don't think any political elite would think that they weren't grilled. Like Barack Obama isn't sending love letters to the media right now, or George W. Bush or something. But it is so I think it's probably a combination of the things you asked. Yeah.
Awesome.
I think very much so. It's their credibility. I think journalism has taken a major hit by the predictions, but also it doesn't help that the first week Trump was in office, he kind of attacked media and journalism, and look at the practices, kind of closing the door to press to kind of come in for conferences and whatnot. But the other thing is that there are some precedents. If you think about George W. Bush and about going to war, right, with the media failed, right? Failed the American people in their role to kind of investigate. Should we really take the word for it, or should we actually investigate? And Lisa said something about, the pressures in the newsroom. Like CNN closed down some years ago their investigative journalism office, which is kind of cable news network. So what part of that should not have investigative, journalism bureau and whatnot? So yeah, all of these.
I would love to add to that. So yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think that when you have someone in power who is saying verifiably false information. There have been instances where people have said things and we as journalists have proven them to be untrue or alternative facts, as some might want to say. I think that has led to an increase in journalists wanting to verify. But also, I think that we're seeing a rise in investigative reporting and more in-depth features because of the fire hose of information that we've mentioned. So many people could distill something to 140 characters and tweet something out. So we need to make something that's more unique and that the public wants and needs. And so I think that's why you might be seeing an increase in longer form journalism.
Mike, no follow-up?
I also just like to add one thing for the public servants who, it's one thing to have all these amazing articles that have been coming out recently, but they're sourced by dozens of people who are calling these journalists, who are putting their careers on the line. So it's not just the journalists, it's also our civic and civil servants who have the guts to kind of correct things and make this an avenue to really check things.
Next question.
Hi, well, she sort of took my question, but as far as it seems from the fake news media perspective, that a lot of the major news outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post have been more on the defensive of late. It seems that, at least from my perspective and the perspective of the American voter, it seems like we're almost approaching like a crisis of conscience as far as like what we're supposed to do as the American voter in an age where a bunch of media outlets claim to be truth. And in your perspective, do you think that we are in an unprecedented age of not just social media and journalism, but American journalism as a whole?
Lisa.
Okay. I think that the crisis of conscience that we might be getting as journalists is that, so notice that I said verifiably untrue and not a lie. So I think that the crisis that we're getting is that we have to redefine things. So we have to redefine some of these words that we're using. And also, I think that we're having to redefine fake news. So if you had asked me a couple years ago what fake news is, I probably would have had a much easier answer and something less extreme than some of these articles that we're seeing that are leading people to go to pizza places because they think that there's some sort of I'm forgetting the actual details, but they think that something terrible is happening at this pizza place because there was a fake news article about it, and we're seeing people being intentionally misled in this way. So I think that that's what we're seeing here, is that we have to redefine some of these terms that we're using.
Next question.
So speaking hypothetically, all my life I've been taught that I can be whoever I want to be. And I imply from that I can believe whatever I want to be. Therefore, I can accept any kind of media that I want to accept. So hypothetically, from that, is it fair to say truth is relative?
I'm gonna spin the question just a little bit. Mike, you encounter students every semester who come in, some of them without an established news source, for example. How do you deal with the student who's looking to understand what news truth or true news might be?
Well, I think, again, we're at a time when some of what you're talking about is ripe for right now in the age of populism that we are right now. Because expertise has either failed people objectively, as we've seen examples do, or there's little respect for authority and expertise, as I think there is, today. So I think there is a spirit of what you're talking about, that some of the underlying fakeness is that the authorities or the mainstream media isn't any more knowledgeable or worthy of trust than we get. And it's kind of one thing we should put in context here. When we talk mainstream media and trustworthiness, they're ranked with Congress. I mean, they're like 20% here from the Gallup. I mean, they're below the criminal justice system, organized. They're below banks who busted our whole economy, right? So TV news, and so they're not well trusted to begin with. And then we add to that this environment around where Americans are questioning authority more generally. That maybe this has something to do with why that's not kind of a unique thought, or that a lot of people are feeling what you're thinking. Mm-hmm. Or hypothesizing, right? That's what she said.
And next.
Hello. So when I'm listening to a credible news source, which I consider NPR to be, sometimes I will hear them interviewing someone who is repeating a lie that's been discredited over and over and over. And I get frustrated when I don't hear them challenging that, or when they, at least when they're finished, saying, for the record, that has been discredited. Is that sort of a journalist's responsibility to do that?
Definitely. And I would say that I do hear that a lot. I do hear reporters and hosts interrupting people who might be speaking and saying, no, I'm sorry, that's not true, or saying it at the end of what they're saying. Occasionally, though, it can't always be verified as completely false. So maybe something that you're thinking, well, that is untrue from where I'm coming from, might not necessarily be untrue entirely. So I don't know maybe any specific examples, but
like the birther movement, for example, that was discredited.
And yes, that's a great example. So so what you're talking about is, of course, people who were saying that President Barack Obama was not born in this country. And I think that we do try to say, no, that's false, that's been discredited. But sometimes if they're trying to make their point, and that's part of it, I guess sometimes maybe it gets slipped through the cracks. But I would think that as a journalist and as a live, we're going back to, of course, there's errors in live radio and TV, and hopefully they catch that. But if not, it is unfortunate.
Well, I think that's part of it. If it's live, you know, there's the ability to challenge it right there on the spot, but depending on how it's said, maybe you don't have time to respond, or you're trying to get at a deeper question. If it's a recorded piece, then you can obviously deal with that in the editing room to some degree. So it does make a little difference whether it's live or something that's being prepared.
And of course, if it were a recorded piece where you're just pulling sound bites from that person, that might not even make it on the air, and hopefully it wouldn't. But what you're probably hearing is live, and again, sometimes it just slips through the cracks, unfortunately.
Awesome.
There's just the point also of decorum. Whatever happened to sort of the manners of giving information rather than having barking matches at one another? And I think, you know, public media has been very good at being respectful but giving you the information. I don't know about that very specific case, but to that point, I've seen cases where it's not particularly a lie when somebody quotes or paraphrases somebody else's lie. I just came across this Andrew Napolitano, who's a Fox contributor, right? So he's talking about Obama's wiretapping and says something about, you know, this is likely true because he heard Justice Scalia told me he often thought that the court was being surveilled, and he told me that probably about 4 or 5 years ago. Okay, well, Justice Scalia is dead. He can now verify that, right? But for some reason, a Fox contributor and the host can actually take that and roll with it. And again, it's the reaffirmation of this, and you know, it takes a life of its own. And you have the media, public media being you know, some of those institutions, right, that take the responsibility of questioning that. And you have the others that don't want to put the resources into, or intentionally or otherwise, into kind of investigating this part of the news. And it's hearsay that sort of takes a life of its own, and, you know, repetition and circulation and expansion and basically, and you said reiteration, right? And so here we have it. It sounds like a fact.
Next question. Well, there's one. Oh, sorry. Thought there's one down in front here, Alex.
I actually have a question maybe for all three of you on maybe just expand on each point. To Awesome's point where you talked about the culpability of the media, what part do you feel that had in the rise of the fake news? And then for Mike, you talked about polls and how the polls were wrong up before the election, and you know, are polls legitimate news? So that's a question for you. And then for Lisa, just the last question was, you know, you talked early on about doing all the fact checking and verifying, and if your mother says she loves you, you know, get a couple sources. You know, a lot of things that are coming up right now are being attributed to anonymous sources, and how can that be affecting the credibility of media?
Who would like to go first on it? Since Lisa's mother's come up several times, let's start with Lisa.
Okay, so for anonymous sources, we're taught in journalism school that there are very, very rare instances when they should be used as the primary source, or at all. Most will err on the side of not using them. For this reason, usually that information can be verified by someone who will go on the record. So you can usually check that out. Sometimes it's an anonymous tip, and then you go forward and independently verify it. So it's like, hey, check out this amendment that is kind of going to slip into this bill. You might not have noticed it. Just don't put me in your story. Just go check it out. That happens sometimes. In which case it's totally fine because then you're independently verifying it as a journalist. In those rare cases, when you have to use an anonymous source, I think that it's especially important that the source's credentials are verified. So you think about one of the most important anonymous sources of all, Deep Throat, in the Watergate scandal. He, of course, remained anonymous until after his death. And that was an FBI assistant director, I believe, so somebody who's working for the FBI. So that, of course, Woodward and Bernstein, the reporters who broke that story, verified that. In today's world, I don't even know if that story would fly. I mean, how many of you would trust that a reporter has checked them out? And that's what's so incredibly sad about that, because I don't think anything's changed from a journalistic standpoint. I think that that journalist would still make sure that that anonymous source is verifiably true. But so many people would discredit that story just because of the source. And that's why you have to try to find somebody who will go on the record.
Awesome. Your question?
Sure. What was my question?
About culpability?
And the rise of fake news and all of that. I think, so in social media and internet, web communication sites and what have you, the phenomenon of trolls comes about, right? Where you have people bullying people online. So partly that's it, but the other part is that, you know, it's a lucrative business for people to come up with, you know, ideas, getting creative and so on. People in Russia and Romania, as you mentioned, Mike, earlier. But I think the reason why it took these alternative facts would take a life of their own is people need to hear them. I think, personally, I think there are so many people out there who are disenfranchised, feel completely marginalized, that they will hang on to anything in terms of why is it that they have low-paying jobs? Why is it that they don't have jobs? Why is it that they don't have healthcare and so on? Of course, you're going to blame the other, the person who doesn't look like you, doesn't speak the language that you do. So it's very easy to kind of pinpoint that and use whatever news that kind of follows that line of thought that kind of you would use as to justify your position and use those as factual points, regardless of whether they are or not. And I think it's very interesting because, you know, this is not new to all of us, but people seem to follow the line or have an affinity for news that kind of agrees with their political viewpoint. So it's a kind of an interesting combination, a lethal one for what it's worth.
Mike, polls?
Yeah, as far as the polls, I mean, it's interesting because as a study, I mean, polls are facing the same issues that the media are. In fact, that there's more of them. It's easier to do in some ways technologically, but more difficult to get to people and maybe some of their attitudes. So again, it's the same kind of irony as the fire hose here. But that doesn't, so the kind of conventional wisdom is that the polls got it all wrong. Not all the polls got it entirely wrong. There was certainly a bias. They nailed Hillary Clinton's results exactly in almost every state except for California and Vermont, you know, the kind of lefty states where some people didn't show up to vote. They undercounted Donald Trump in most states. So there was as he said, a silent majority, a silent almost majority, because he didn't win the majority. But that was there that is hard to map. When you're looking at a potential set of voters, it's very difficult to map who's actually going to show up. And these were people that hadn't shown up in the numbers they did. And I think some people would say that's good that people turn out to vote that weren't expected to. Their actual behavior, you know, the human will and kind of citizenship kind of outperformed what we under-expected of them. So some of that. But as far as your other point about the use of polls, the more and more media sources are coming up with their own polls because it's an easy story to have, right? It's not easy all the time to talk about the kind of complication of the American civil service and how slow it is because it's not a new story each day. A new poll number is a new story each day. You can come out and say, well, Donald Trump has dropped 2 percentage points, even though it's likely not that he did, that it's within the margins. But at least it's new. And so the media environment has produced all of these polls also because it helps have a story the next day, that there's change in the political world that often, until this presidency, in a lot of ways, was kind of boring. You know, I mean, politics is stable a lot of times, and we kind of forget that. In fact, so coming up with these kind of new things, as you noted with the polling, it's not surprising that more media agencies are partnering with polling firms or themselves are running polls.
I think there are kind of 2 themes here. One is that we actually have a desire for information to come out faster and faster. We're not really waiting for the newspaper the next morning or the 6 o'clock broadcast or morning edition. That's part of it. And then secondly, as news agencies have had to cut back, they've had to look for ways to fill whatever the news hole is, and that's in some respects a dangerous combination, isn't it? Well, let's take one last question. So Alexis has the joy of picking the last question, and that didn't take long. I thought there was going to be a longer walk. That's why I was giving some lead up to that.
I understand the need for the use of sensationalism in ticklers and in opening stories on broadcast, particularly the spoken media. I've heard it said you wouldn't watch the 6 o'clock news if the lead story said your neighbor's house didn't burn down today. But to what extent do you think sensationalism has contributed to the whole concept of fake news?
Mike or Austin, one of you mentioned something earlier.
Clickbait, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, clickbait is the other side of it is, I mean, we think of how dare they, or they, you know, how nasty they are. The bait, what about the other side of the bait? Who's taking the bait is very, very important. And so I think there's some responsibility, certainly. This is not placing it just on the American voter, but you know, our institutions, we've moved away from some things that maybe we shouldn't have, that can make things seem more sensational. We have fewer civics classes in high school, which as a political science professor I think is not good. But you know, so we're leaving people probably, ironically, even though we're more well-educated these days, maybe less educated about some things than we used to be. And one of those things is the functions of government and why it works so crazy, and why things that might appear crazy and be alarming on one level are really, in fact, the proper way that they go about. And so I think some of it's in that way that we're able to kind of, at least a lot of the American public are able to be alarmed at something that probably has an explanation, or probably has something that there's no better alternative. A lot of government is that there isn't a better alternative, but it sounds alarming when it happens. So I guess the bait part for me is what I'd add.
Awesome, or Lisa?
I would love to add on to that in that, yeah, who is the bait in this clickbait? And I think that that's where you come in. That's where you have to not take the bait. And that's why you're here, to learn more about, you know, what to click on, what to not click on. And I think that any good news outlet will not try to sensationalize its headline in a way that makes it seem like something that it's not, in a way that makes you want to click on it, in a way that makes you want to click on it for being something that it's not. Of course, obviously, as a headline, you want to make it a good summary of what you're doing, and then if you want to learn more about tax increases or more about President Donald Trump's budget proposal or anything like that, obviously, you're clicking on that because that's in the headline. But I'm talking about the things that say, click here for the 5 easy ways to lose weight or anything like that. Obviously, that's an extreme example, but I think that's what you're seeing on your social media posts. That's what you're seeing all over the internet. And I think that it's sensationalized because people are clicking on it and they're making money off of it. And again, that's where you can come in and not click on that clickbait article.
Awesome.
There we go. It's about consumption. It's about consumerism. News is a commodity. It's no longer informative. I would like to take us back a little bit to the 90s, right? 1996, when we had sort of a news channel that went 24 hours, although CNN had been there and whatnot. But this is a very interesting format where you have to have news, right, kind of fill in these hours for you. So what do? You create controversy. You allow for talking heads to kind of bite each other's heads off and kind of come up with, sensational ways of talking, whether in a way that it becomes more of a wrestling match than it is information, right? So that kind of proved to be the formula for allowing people to kind of, not switch away, right? Wait for the commercials to end to kind of go back to what is being said and so on. The problem with that is you end up just having the fights. You're not having the context. You're not having the analysis, the appropriate analysis. We end up with stereotypes. I mean, I don't want to suggest that it's the news that caused, wars or kind of certain stereotypes or what have you. There was a promotion of this, of the stereotypes of, what is terrorism? So every time, we hear about Muslims, we kind of associate the word ban with it right now, right? Because, you have certain news stations or cable news that kind of have promoted this image, and it's very easy to kind of, why not? They're not going to challenge something that they've been, kind of letting go, because hatred apparently does have its audience, and vitriol and so on. So the problem with that is it's such an easy shortcut to kind of go back to. And, again, the circulation, the going back, the regurgitation of this news that is not much different from last week, not much different from the year before. It's just in different, formats or scenarios. And that's the sad part.
I would like to thank our panelists, Mike Wolf from the Department of Political Science, Asim Nasser from the Department of Communication, Lisa Ryan from WVOI. Please give them a round of applause.